I want to hang a map of the world in my house. And then I'm going to put pins into all the locations that I travel to. But first I'm going to have to travel to the top 2 corners of the map so it won't fall down.
Factorio's procedurally generated planets might seem like they go on forever, but for technical reasons they do end eventually. It's a long eventually, 1 million tiles in every direction worth of eventually. But if you're crazy and possibly unemployed enough, you can technically get there. So naturally, there are a few people who have journeyed to the edge of Factorio's home planet of Novice, and even a couple who built machines to clear the path for them. But we're living in the space age now, with 4 brand new planets to conquer. They each pose unique challenges for a factory, so why don't we see if the same is true of exploring to their furthest reaches? That's right, we're going to knock out 4 world firsts in one video, by building machines that will automatically travel to the edges of Aquilo, Fulgora, Gleba, and yes, even Vulcanus. In fact, let's not just get to their edges. I'd like to see some evidence that these maps are actually squares, so let's get to their corners. Hey, if I'm going to take on a challenge this stupid, I might as well make it square root of 2 times more stupid. Designing a machine that builds its own way to the end of the world is not a task for the faint of heart, so let's start with an easy one, Aquilo. Yeah, Aquilo is an easy one, can you believe that? We'll need a mod called Recursive Blueprints, which lets you place a blueprint or a deconstruction planner in a special chest and send it circuit signals to trigger them at a given location. What we'll be building is basically a long train line. We'll want to travel to the corners ourselves when all is said and done, and trains are the fastest way to get anywhere. But of course, we'll also need plenty of roboports so bots can actually build it. We'll be dividing the line into segments of 100 tiles in both directions, which makes the math easier and strikes a good balance between length and minimizing bot travel time. The foremost design concern is how to actually move supplies a million tiles away. Bots are power hungry, belts are annoying, and either one would melt your CPU. So basically the only sane option is to make a conga line of trains, each one loaded with all the supplies necessary to build one segment. Once they reach the end, we can simply deconstruct them, and the bots will dump all their contents into storage chests, ready to build the next segment. Because of that, we'll have the bots construct 2 parallel train lines, one for the supply trains and a separate one for me. Making trains travel an indefinite distance diagonally introduces a couple of snags. Since there's no such thing as a diagonal train stop, every segment needs this tiny little detour just to add 1 vertical and 1 horizontal rail segment so we can actually place train stops. I also thought I could get away with just 1 stop per segment. But game version 2.0 changed the pathing algorithm such that if a train is already at a stop with a given name, it will never attempt to go from there directly to another stop with that same name. That worked fine in 1.1, but now we'll need 2 stops per segment with 2 alternating names just to force the trains to actually move. Next is the problem of how to load the trains. If you've ever built a defense unload station for Novice or Gleba, it's basically the same principle in reverse. To save on supplies, we want to load the trains with only what's needed to build 1 segment, plus maybe a few spares, but no more than that. We can do that by reading the contents of the train while it's stopped at the load station and comparing that to values set in some constant combinators. When the amount of any item in the train meets or exceeds the constant values, that item signal will disappear from these inserter filters, preventing any more of that item from being loaded. Actually getting the train to stop at the load station without altering the 2 stops in series schedule can be done by naming the load station the same as one of those 2 stops and keeping it there with an inactivity timer. But as of 2.0, it's easier to just use an interrupt. We can trigger it when cargo is empty, which should only happen immediately after pasting the train, and then keep it there until the combinators detect that all items have been sufficiently loaded and send an all-clear signal. Each train will also need to be given plenty of fuel for the journey. Nuclear fuel is better for acceleration and top speeds, but ordinary rocket fuel is significantly easier to produce on planets not named Novice. Conveniently, as of 2.0, it's also more energy dense per stack, so there's no real downside to using locally made rocket fuel on all 4 planets. Now to actually build the machine that will build the train line to the end of the world. I'd like to not have to build all 4 of these machines completely from scratch, so instead I'm aiming to make these out of modular pieces. The first piece will be the master control. Enabling a constant combinator will turn on a clock and start counting which segment we're currently building. Segment counter times segment dimensions plus an offset should give us the coordinates we need. Every segment will need to be built in multiple steps, so this will also track which step of the current segment we're on. Each step will either place a blueprint or trigger a deconstruction planner, and they'll both work basically the same way. First, we'll run down a sort of pre-flight checklist, a set of conditions that must all be met before actually triggering the blueprint or the deconstructor. The basic ones will be to check that the step counter says we're on the given step of the process, check that we have enough bots and that they're all available, and in the case of the blueprint paster, check that we have enough supplies in the logistic network to actually build the blueprint. When all these conditions are met, we can deploy the blueprint or the deconstructor. Then we have to wait for the bots to start moving, because experimentation has shown that they can sometimes take several seconds to actually begin working. Once they've started moving, we then wait for them to stop, which will tell us that construction or deconstruction has finished. Only after that can we increment the step counter and proceed to the next step. The train deconstructor is a bit special because we'll want an additional pre-flight check to make sure a train is actually stopped at the last station before we attempt to deconstruct it. We'll also want to set the combinators to only trigger construction or deconstruction for a single frame, lest we accidentally do things like deconstruct 2 trains in a row. Changing filters and other circuit conditions on entities that have already been placed is also a special case, because no bots need move. You just paste over the existing entities and they'll adopt the new filters. Here, we're pasting over a constant combinator to clear a circuit condition, so we can control when to allow a train to proceed to the newly constructed end of the line. There are also several other conditions we're setting at the same time. Trailing roboports will cease reporting any signals so their values aren't duplicated, and trailing train stations will cease reporting stopped train IDs, so only the leading station can validate that a train is stopped there before it gets deconstructed. Most importantly, we're setting filters on the trailing storage chests to items that the bots will never encounter. That forces the bots to dump new items only in the unfiltered chests closest to the front, which greatly reduces their travel time. Then I add on some Nixie tube displays for some clocks, so we can see how long the machine has taken so far, and how long we can expect it to take before being finished. Now for the train line itself. This will also vary from planet to planet, to account for the different weather conditions and native wildlife. Aquilo's primary challenge is the sheer cold, which requires us to warm up the roboports before they'll actually host the bots or connect to the logistic network. The most space and item efficient way to accomplish that while building diagonally is to simply place a pair of roboports at the corners of each heating tower. Of course, we can't quite test that in a lab configured with novice presets, so let's use the editor to generate all planets and transition to actually testing on Aquilo. Combinators freeze too, so it's a good thing I left some space between each module for heat pipes. I try turning the machine on, and almost immediately we can see the bots starting to seize up. Sometimes they don't even make it all the way to their destination before needing to head all the way back to recharge. Out of curiosity, I let it run for a while, and soon it estimates a total runtime of a whopping 73 days. I decide to solve this problem with more roboports. The extra items needed and extra time spent placing them should be more than counteracted by the extra recharging spots. Another test run, and sure enough, that gets us down to a cool 49 days. This strategy does have the unintended consequence of needing each train to carry too much stuff to fit in one wagon. So I extend the train and dedicate the second wagon purely to rocket fuel. Speaking of unintended consequences, you know how we're only pasting blueprints for a single frame? Well, that means the print can get permanently chopped off if we accidentally paste it into the void. Roboports have built-in radar coverage now, but it only extends to a 2-chunk radius, not the 4 chunks we'd need to guarantee 100 tiles of visibility. So that forces us to build the train line across 2 steps, starting with the first half of the roboports to reveal the next few chunks of the map before we can then paste everything else. I'm getting sick of pasting new trains manually, so it's time to do something about that. We want a good number of trains on the line at all times to make sure some trains are always close to the front. But we don't want too many trains either, primarily because pathfinding for thousands of trains would bog down my CPU. So we'll want to paste trains independently from the main blueprint loop, and track pasting progress with rail signal state changes rather than bot state changes, since train loading will be unavoidably connected to the planet's main bot network. When a train is pasted, we'll increment a counter, and when a train is deconstructed, we'll decrement that counter. The clever part is that we'll feed that value back to a pre-flight check, ensuring that the total number of trains in the system never surpasses a configurable amount. Now that the system can theoretically run unsupervised, I run another test. This time it hangs indefinitely because the last 2 tiles got chopped off, which, sure enough, is right at a chunk boundary. That seems like a good excuse to build an alarm system. First, we'll add a new pre-flight condition to every step that says we can't start the step if there's an active alarm, meaning the machine will pause execution if something broke. Then we'll add 3 simple alarms, 2 for if either bot count falls below a critical threshold, and 1 for if the current segment has taken way more time than it typically takes to build. Any of those 3 are good signs that the process is broken. Another test, and getting those 2 tiles chopped off again does trigger an alarm, so at least that works. The root cause here appears to be that the foremost roboport in the first step didn't thaw out and reveal enough territory before the second step triggered. We can solve this problem by adding a configurable delay to the end of the first step. I don't really like this answer because it slows down the build process, but I don't have any better ideas right now. I also added the ability to automatically reset that delay timer back to 0 if ammo is loaded into a turret. I never ended up using that feature, but it doesn't hurt to be prepared. One other feature I want to add for Aquilo is deconstruction of fuel requester chests for the heating towers. This will gradually cause trailing roboports to freeze over, but that's better than letting useless roboports far from the front continue to leach fuel for weeks on end. That does mean some bots will likely get stranded in frozen roboports, so we'll carry a few spares in each train and add them to the network if the respective bot count gets too low. Yet another test, and it seems like it's working now. The only remaining wrinkle is a slow but steady power increase over time. Apparently, even frozen roboports still draw idle power. But some back-of-the-napkin math tells me we can get all the way to the end of the world with just 1 extra fusion power block, so we should be fine. Finally, we'll split this machine apart into its component blueprints in preparation for the next planet, Fulgora. Fulgora is also fairly straightforward, because there's no enemies here either, only hazardous weather. The backbone of our train lines here is a simple combination of roboports, lightning collectors, and big power poles. The biggest problem is making the massive amount of foundation we'll need to carry across the oil ocean, but we can help ourselves out on that front by elevating the personal rail line. Would that we could also do that for the supply line, but we'd still need some of it to be ground level for the train stops, plus some added ramps that would increase the size of the detour and thus increase bot travel times, so it isn't worth the effort. It then occurred to me that this idea would also help on Aquilo, since the bots would need to place much fewer entities to cross the same distance. Sure enough, that single change takes so much stress off the bots that it knocks the 49-day estimation down to about 40, which I'm not gonna argue with. Later, I also get the idea to split off the second stage roboports into a separate step, so the bots have more guaranteed recharging spots available while building the item-heavy train line, and that knocks a couple more days off the estimation. But back to Fulgora. We'll need to build out the inner scaffolding in several increments to maintain lightning coverage. If any bot wanders outside the safe zone while carrying items, it could get obliterated by lightning and cause the whole build to fail for lack of supplies. Unlike Aquilo, we don't have anything we need to deconstruct as we go here, so we'll place the rail line first and then magically place the concrete under it while the foremost train is advancing, so the bots aren't sitting idle while the train moves up. We don't strictly need concrete on Fulgora, or anywhere except Aquilo, but can I really call this project a success if it's not even minimally decorated? Anyway, our first test here eventually fails because you can't blueprint over Fulgoran lightning attractors by default. It can be done, but only with superforce building. Thankfully, Recursive Blueprints lets us do that by paying respects to the blueprint chest. Another test and we get the taking too long alarm, but the build itself appears to be totally fine. I reload and autosave and eventually spot the issue. Bots are sometimes, but not always, forced to pick up a ton of random junk. I increase the alarm threshold to 5 times the average segment time, but eventually it breaks again despite there again being no apparent problem other than the mountain of garbage in the way. So we need a super high alarm threshold on Fulgora because its terrain is highly variable, but still not so high on Aquilo because its terrain is consistent. That feels like a good reason to make the alarm threshold configurable in a constant combinator, rather than hard-coding it. While I'm at it, let's build in a separate, happier alarm for if we detect that we've reached the edge of the map. Now it's time to design for Gleba, and can you see why I usually play with a decorative removal mod? Just look at all this junk on my beautiful sterile concrete. For the first time, we have to think about defenses. Tesla turrets are an absolute must for their ability to stun stompers, and backing them up with rocket turrets for raw damage is also a good idea. But we can't just blithely build an unbroken line of turrets all the way to the end of the world, because Tesla turrets draw a megawatt each at idle, which would mean a minimum of 500 gigawatts by the end. So we'll have to deconstruct these as we go. First, let's build out our power. A grid of substations behind the turrets should keep our power delivery clean and well protected. For the defenses themselves, I settle on a repetition of this design that uses pairs of rocket turrets guarded by 5 Tesla turrets. We'll also need a bit of artillery here to take care of egg rafts. For the record, I don't necessarily care about concrete under everything we're placing down. The defenses are getting ripped up as we go, after all, and it would seem a bit silly to leave a bunch of bare concrete in our wake. I used wood as the impossible item for storage chest filtering on Aquilo and Fulgora, but plenty of the trees we'll be clearing here on Gleba do give wood. That means we need some other impossible item to filter on, so I don't know, crude oil barrels. And at the end of all this, we need to carry about 2,500 landfill per train. Yeah, we'll get to that. Moving artillery shells via normal cargo wagon sucks because they only stack to 1. But artillery wagons are more trouble than they're worth when you need them in the thousands. I considered artillery damage research to reduce the amount we need to carry, but guaranteeing a one-shot on maximum evolution egg rafts requires research level 20, which costs 1 billion science, so that's also not worth it. So, not much choice but to awkwardly tack on an extra wagon just for shells, and just as awkwardly lengthen the machine to fit a 4-long train. Time for a test. I paste the machine, drop in the blueprints, configure the combinators, add items for the first section into storage, try turning it on, screw up the coordinates, try again, realize I forgot cliff explosives, try again, realize I also forgot repair packs, try again. Yeah, there's a reason trial and error usually gets left on the cutting room floor. Turns out we don't need any sort of timer on our defense perimeter, because we're building the train line after the defenses, so the bots still have stuff to do while attacks are coming in. One thing those bots might do is pick up eggs on the ground and happily shove them into storage. But the trailing defenses linger long enough that they're always around to zap them. And speaking of eggs, you know how we have artillery for the rafts? Well, I assumed said artillery would be able to fire into undiscovered territory. But no. Until a roboport actually generates the chunks in question, the artillery targeting has no clue whether an enemy is there or not. Because of that, building all my defenses in one step means I'm quite likely to build them directly on top of enemy strongholds, which can obviously break the entire machine. So my only option is to build the defenses in sections, including them right along with their substation scaffolding and roboports. That seems like a good change, and you can see here how the bots have been picking up the trailing defense turrets as the line builds out. That has the added benefit of meaning we can reuse those turrets, so we only need to carry a few spares in each train. This is also when it occurs to me that it would be a good idea to put a non-braking alarm on the train loader itself when it detects we're getting a bit too low on any requested supplies. But it seems like Gleba is working. Okay. Vulcanus. This is by far the hardest planet for trying to automatically reach the end of the world. Mostly that's because the native demolishers are by far the hardest enemies in the game to kill, and killing them unintelligently is an extra task and a half. Our only real turret option is a perimeter of railgun turrets which will be deconstructed as we go. And since quality increases both range and health, we need them to be legendary railgun turrets. We absolutely cannot risk demolishers getting close enough to plow through our precious train line like a criminally insane game show host plowing through the east wing of the White House. So the farther away we can kill these things from, the better. Their firing cone is fairly narrow, but they do face 8 possible directions, so we'll make this sort of dome shape up front. For testing, we'll manually set evolution to its maximum. Small and medium demolishers aren't exactly what I'm worried about here. Now, hitting demolishers from the side is much less effective than hitting them head-on, because railguns pierce and each segment counts towards total damage. But we have literally no control over what angle we'll encounter these things at, so even the most disadvantageous still has to end in our favor. This right here is why turret health matters. These have 10,000 HP, and a single demolisher explosion from range just lopped off 6,000 of that like it was nothing. We also have to leave these turrets in place long enough to allow demolishers in any size territory to basically happen to wander into them. We can't draw aggro with artillery because they're mobile units, and building on their territory doesn't necessarily immediately make them angry either. So we have no guarantee of exactly when a demolisher might strike. Oh yeah, and did I mention that each and every segment needs up to 1,500 foundation? You know, across 10,000 segments. And so, much like Gleba, the first wagon of the train will be basically just foundation and concrete, and the second will carry fuel, building supplies, and ammo. The one defensive saving grace here is that railguns don't take many shots to kill, so we don't need to carry too much ammo per train. The plan is to only carry one railgun turret per train for spares in the network, but we'll still need a few hundred to make the initial 5-segment long perimeter. At first, I try building a short, fully enclosed section of perimeter, waiting a few seconds, and then deconstructing the front dome to make room for the next partial section. That seems to work okay, but we're taking more consistent losses than I'd like. And soon enough, it fails outright because a demolisher came for it while the next section of perimeter was being built. New plan. Lay down the foundation and the ammo chests first, since that takes the bulk of the bot time. Then just dump the turrets on top all at once so they can all load and activate near simultaneously. And that does help, but not enough. Hey, you know what else would help? Actually upgrading railgun damage. After bumping that up to level 15, the same demolisher in the same place gives us no trouble. But there's still a problem. Deconstructing the front dome of turrets before building the next section leaves us vulnerable to frontal attacks. So I'm forced to leave the dome in place while constructing the next section, including the next dome, and only after that can I safely deconstruct the previous dome. That does mean it's entirely possible for a front-facing turret to destroy other turrets that happen to be in the firing path. But since the alternative is to not have a firing path at all, we don't really have a choice. See? Saved our bacon. Look at that. I can scarcely believe it, but it seems like the Vulcanus machine is actually working. Of course, it's one thing to design these in a lab, and another thing to build them in the actual game. It would be cheating to supply our expeditions with a single Infinity Provider chest, after all. However, if you were paying attention to the numbers I've been tossing around, you might realize that we need some pretty expensive supplies in absolutely unheard of quantities. You need a megabase to even attempt this. So, here's a megabase. If you're wondering how I made all this, you're in luck. I have several hours worth of fully edited videos showing exactly how I got from 0 to here, and the playlist for all of them is linked in the description. I'm sorry if you were expecting me to start completely from scratch within this video, but it would be a massive waste of your time and especially mine to undertake a second space-age megabase when I already have a perfectly good one just laying around. That said, this megabase was designed to churn out tens of millions of science, not tens of millions of building supplies, so there's still plenty of new infrastructure we have to build out. For starters, Gleba's stone patches are pathetically small, nowhere near enough to supply the 25 million landfill we'll need, so we'll have to import all of that from somewhere else. Vulcanus is the obvious choice because stone is a free byproduct of lava processing there. We'll need to keep making that stone even if we're full on iron or copper, so this block will automatically convert the molten stuff into plates and then void them in lava if we have plenty of molten metal but not enough stone. Naturally, we'll also want to do the inverse, voiding stone if we have plenty of that but not enough molten metal. Nothing a couple combinators can't handle. Now, landfill only has a rocket capacity of 20, and Gleba will need about 500 a minute. So each block will need a rather large array of silos to simultaneously launch it all into space. 6 blocks of this should be enough. Next is Gleba's rockets and artillery shells, which require explosives, which requires coal. On Gleba, you can only get coal from coal synthesis, which takes a lot of carbon, which in turn takes a lot of spoilage. There is no way I want to include a full bioflux build for a single production line of carbon, so we'll bot in the bioflux for nutrient production and use efficiency modules to make the most of it. I briefly considered making radars on site for the shells, but nah. We need to bring in some ingredients via bot anyway, and radars craft quickly, so bot mall supply shouldn't be an issue. Then we top off the block with a pickup for any spoiled nutrients. It leaves a big ugly gap, but we'll just call it Spidertron parking. Then we'll need a ton of power. Remember that Roboport idle draw? Yeah, that will present a problem on every planet. But rather than expand the native power sources a gigawatt at a time, and in so doing massively increase rocket fuel or sulfuric acid consumption, it's both easier and more computationally efficient to just slap down a fusion block. It needs a little alteration from the Aquilo design since we don't have to keep it warm anywhere else, but that's straightforward enough. We can even shorten the block a bit. Then, on Vulcanus, we'll need railgun ammo and cliff explosives. We need steam condensation for water, copper for wire, and a bunch of other random odds and ends. So this ends up looking like a mess of train stations surrounding a tangle of belts. But it works. Now, we need a ton of infinite research to get to the end of the world, which means we'll have to stop researching research productivity. That does require manually turning off the biter egg requests on our Prometheum ships, so they don't grab 20,000 eggs and then self-destruct while idling half an hour later. Looking at the tech tree, however, I realized we've already done the vast bulk of our necessary research while stress testing this megabase. Railgun damage and shooting speed, rocket part and ingredient productivity, tons of mining productivity, worker robot speed, all about where they need to be. But there are a couple things we can add, like a bit of electric weapons damage so our Tesla turrets on Gleba have some kick of their own. Then we'll do a few extra levels of worker robot speed research because, building faster is better. Next, we'll want faster and more reliable interplanet cargo transportation, so let's replace all these with the third generation ship I designed at the end of my last Megabase video. Each pair of inner planets will get a dedicated hauler. Speaking of Gleba, let's add some extra production there. We'll start by going from 1 carbon fiber block to 3, which we'll need for both Foundation and the legendary railgun turret grind. And then our explosives and artillery production can go up top. Now, all 4 of those blocks require a steady supply of spoilage to make their carbon, and I realized that had an uncomfortable implication.
What is my purpose?
You make spoilage.
Oh my god.
Yep, this here is a spoilage production block. It exists to multiply bioflux into nutrients and then force them to rot in some boxes. Still, I'm not a monster. We'll add a spoilage load monitoring system to our global red and green wires, and then only trigger spoilage production if demand ever outstrips supply. Then a quick spot of fusion power to cover the roboports, and then the machine itself. Plus some mall production for things we wouldn't otherwise need, like burner inserters for the train refueling. I forgot to add cliff explosives to the ammunition mall, so I haphazardly shove some explosives from the belt into the logistic network and throw in an assembler. Yes, we're already making some cliff explosives in the bot mall, but not quickly enough. With all our landfill imports, I'm worried about overflowing such a small landing pad area, so let's round this all out by grinding for some legendary cargo bays. And just in case those landfill imports ever get held up, let's add a second stone mine. Hopefully we'll never need to use it. On to Aquilo. Railgun turrets need plenty of quantum processors, which get half their ingredients in via bot, so we'll place a second quantum processor block as near the mall as we can manage. And a second fusion power block also nearby. In case you'd forgotten from the design phase, bots on Aquilo suck, so we have to help them out a little. We'll also need plenty more raw lithium and lithium plate, so here's another lithium field, another lithium processing block, and another lithium smelting block. I planned ahead for our fluoroketone production target last video, but we'll need more fluorine to supply it, so here's a new fluorine field too. While we're here, let's get a head start on railgun turret upcycling. We'll need several hundred legendary turrets just to start the process on Vulcanus, and we are very lucky that such expensive items are made in a machine that takes 8 quality modules. While that's running, I check the game's debug update data. Seems like it's updating every 6 milliseconds or so, which is honestly better than I expected. But that does mean the game can only speed up about 3 times max. Back of the napkin math? At least 44 real-time days straight to make all 4 journeys, and that's not counting any potential lag or production interruptions. Anyway, we still need to mass-produce ice platform here, and I also don't want to risk running out of rocket fuel. Both those things require oil, so let's envelop another oil field and drop a bunch of production right here. This particular journey will require a ton of imports, which we'll mostly get from Fulgora. It's closer than Novice or Vulcanus, and the items we need the most of are pretty much all immediate derivatives from Fulgora's omni-resource of scrap. Conversely, we'll also have to ship out lithium plate by the hundreds of thousands for Foundation on Vulcanus and Fulgora. So rather than put the bots through all that stress, let's draft up a quick lithium plate launch block. Fulgora's Mall has plenty of space for extra landing pads, so we don't have to grind for legendary ones to guard against item overflow. The fusion reactor block here will also border the mall so the bots can refuel it. I didn't make a global bot network on Fulgora, owing to the geography and the weather, so anything that needs bots has to directly border the mall. I spread out so far on this planet that this scrap processing block would be in the way of our path to the southwest corner, so it has to go. Ripping it out is more than a little annoying given all the trash we have to haul back, but then this is the trash planet. You know what, while we're here, let's grind for some legendary mech armor. I still haven't gotten that achievement yet. The Fulgora machine needs to be pasted a ways away from the mall to avoid having to rip out even more infrastructure, so we need to build out a network of roboports and lightning collectors to bridge the gap. And that leaves Vulcanus. Right off the bat, our new landfill and molten metal blocks will need lava for both resources and voiding, and there's no great lava patches to drop them on top of. But there is a way to make lava here. It requires some collateral damage, but nothing fatal. Then we pave right back over it and repaste the block before deleting the relevant tiles. The old processing pickups left behind a ton of stone that I don't feel like shoving into storage, so it's getting deleted. While I'm doing a lot of block reorganization anyway, I decide to move the foundation block adjacent to the mall, so the bots don't have to carry its imports halfway across the base. But this placement overlaps a small tungsten patch, which I don't like. Time to add a mod that lets us delete resources. And while we're at it, how about a mod that lets us delete destroyed structures, like these old anti-demolisher turrets? Then we top it off with the fusion block, the ammo block, and the machine itself. We'll need to carry a ton of tungsten products to Aquilo for the railguns, and right now that's all being handled by mall silos. For a while, I debate giving carbide and plate their own launch blocks, but ultimately I decide against it. My outer planet hauler design needs a bit of rest time to refresh its fuel and oxidizer anyway. Again, we'll need several hundred legendary railgun turrets just to build out the initial perimeter, so I set up this buffer chest to keep those turrets flowing from the landing pad. A bit more testing shows me that we appear to be losing an average of 1 legendary railgun turret every 7 segments. That's an important metric, because even with a second quantum processor block, we're still producing less than half the number we'd need to give each train its own turret, so we need a way to scale it back. First, that requires a tweak to the train pasting combinators, so it can also track the total number of trains we've pasted. Then that lets us modify the train loading combinators to only insert a railgun once every 3 trains. That's more than we're losing, but less than we can produce, so it's an ideal target. Yeah, that's a decent start. Now we just need to punch all the interplanetary logistic requests into our haulers. And there goes our first shipment of landfill to Gleba. A bit later, I happen to notice that none of our haulers are moving, with most of them stuck around Novice. That appears to be because the rockets have no rocket fuel, because the entire oil build is deadlocked on too much petroleum. Apparently, pausing our research drastically cut our plastic demand. So I flush it and switch the solid fuel production to use petroleum instead of light oil. Anyway, the actual last thing I want to add is a ton of refueling stations on Fulgora bordering the mall. There's been a couple instances where trains have monopolized the only existing refueling station for long enough that other trains have run out of fuel, which we can't risk going forward. We'll use the extra space in the middle for a few more export silos, and set this block between the mall and the machine. Okay, I think that should be everything, so it's time to turn on one of these machines for real. That gives me an achievement for building a train, and a couple extra happen to pop at the same time. I'm running on a standalone copy of the game now, so as not to screw up my Steam cloud saves, so all the achievements are fresh. And just as planned, the bots finish building one segment, delete the advancing train, and use its supplies to start building the next segment. And the combinators by the train load station appear to be doing their job of limiting supplies. The timers need a few iterations to complete before they have enough information to make reasonable estimates, so they're a little out of whack right now, but they'll converge soon enough. Then we get an error, which technically wasn't my fault. Curved rails take more than one rail item to place because curved segments are longer than one ordinary straight rail segment, which is fair enough. Here you can see a curved segment that needs 3 rails to place, and there's 3 rails in the logistic system. But guess what? 2 of them are in one chest, and 1 is in another chest. And apparently the bots aren't smart enough to grab items from more than one. I really thought I could get away with having no spares in the network, but it turns out I'll need a few extra just to compensate for the bot's Tylenol exposure. But we got that taken care of, and it seems to be working, minus this persistent low resource warning. A mouse over the relevant combinator tells me it's complaining about ice platform. I thought a build this big would be enough, but it turns out it doesn't run constantly because it produces solid fuel faster than the heating towers can consume it. Even so, it's still outpacing the rate we need to sustain our train supply, so this error should go away on its own once we hit the train cap. That said, a bit of math I failed to do beforehand tells me that said cap of 250 trains, which I thought would be plenty to keep the front line saturated, is only just barely sufficient, so I bump it up to 400. Then we get another alarm, and what the hell? How is that even possible? I'm sorry for using the editor, but it was absolutely necessary to debug this one. And yeah, it was the stupid bots again. So you know how we increment the step counter once all the bots have returned home? Well, in this case, the last logistic bot only stayed home for 1 frame before it realized it forgot something and flew right back out again. Long story short, that caused the step counter to increment 7 times instead of just once. You can see the machine just assumes we've skipped straight to the middle of the next segment, hence the quite literal disconnect. I fixed this by adding a memory cell after the return home trigger, so the trigger keeps broadcasting even if a bot immediately decides to up and wander off again. This is also when I discovered that the unpause switch has a bug that prevents new trains from being pasted, so I manually reset that and hope I don't need to use it again. Maybe I'll fix it in the blueprints later. Just look at how long this thing is already, and it's not even 10% of the way there. Anyway, now it seems to be working, so time to sit back and relax while the machine does machine things.
Several long days later.
Okay, it's working, but there's still a problem. You remember how we're deconstructing the fuel requester chests as we go and letting the trailing roboports freeze over? Well, I assumed that starving the heating towers and letting them reach a steady state would be sufficient to keep the lag at bay. But no. The game is still recalculating the heat load for every single heating tower on every single frame. And across 30,000 some towers, that's some serious CPU time. We're a third of the way there, and already the computational load of just the heating towers is on par with all the rest of my bases combined. There is no way this will maintain 60 frames per second all the way to the end. I can't go back through the network and deconstruct the towers since the roboports are frozen over, but even if I could, one of the weaknesses of my master control design is that I can't add or remove steps while the process is running. So after a bit of math, I realize the fastest option available is to restart the entire process, all the way from segment 1. At least the game runs in the background, so it's not blocking me from doing other things, but that's still 5 days of progress down the drain. Okay, since we're deconstructing the heating towers anyway, we might as well delete the roboports too and carry them all forward to reuse in building the next segment. The extra time from adding roboports to the pickup list is negligible, and it'll save us a ton of supplies as well as completely obviate the need for that second fusion power block. The total time increase is about 1:40 per segment, which bumps us back up to a 47-day estimate. But it also means the game should maintain its roughly 3x speed boost, so real time will still be faster. After adding on the deconstructors and tweaking the train contents, we should be ready for another attempt. Spoiler alert, after a RAM upgrade, this one actually worked, so have a montage. That's 1 out of 4 down. After making a new save and resetting back to the beginning, it's time to set out for Fulgora. Sorry if you were expecting all 4 of these behemoths to be on a single save file, but just this one ballooned the RAM usage to over 24 gigabytes, so I have to make some concessions to computational realities. Despite an entire megabase here with my name all over it, the game seems quite convinced that I've never been here before. Anyway, we have a few more revisions to take care of before we can get started here. If you haven't seen my previous megabase videos, the general theory behind these blocks is that trains are loaded and unloaded in parallel, and each wagon feeds a dedicated production row. And that's fine as long as every row is producing at the same rate. But if consumption ever becomes imbalanced, that will propagate up the chain and cause problems like this. So, after manually rebalancing the foundation block, we need to find a way to keep it from crashing out again. First, let's lay down a bunch of beacons between the rocket silos so they craft fast enough to skip the door opening and closing animations. I probably don't need this many beacons, but I definitely don't feel like figuring out what the optimal number is. Then, to maintain balance, let's ditch the unified foundation output line in favor of a simpler design where each production row feeds a dedicated row of silos. And with that out of the way, let's try turning the machine on. It breaks almost immediately, or at least what passes for immediately on a timescale measured in weeks, because there's no trains in the system? I've heard it said that programming is when clever is a compliment and engineering is when clever is an insult. Well, this here was the latter. I thought I could let the rails and the cliff explosives share a requester chest, but since the inserter hand size is greater than 1, it got stuck trying to insert more cliff explosives into a train when all the train wanted was more rail. The solution is to keep things simple and give cliff explosives and rails separate requester chests. The next problem was yet again the fault of bots being stupid. It's a subtle color shift, but this particular shade of blue means that a bot has found the roboport and assigned itself to the construction task, and yet nothing's getting constructed. That can only mean that a bot is trying to grab a roboport from far, far away, even though there's one in a chest right there. I tried deleting and replacing the ghost, which does trigger a closer bot to find the closer roboport and place it. But since the idiot bot is still in flight, the machine still isn't getting the all clear to move to the next step. It does eventually get there, several minutes later, but the farther out we build, the less we can afford to risk the bots doing that. Again, I thought I could get away with no spares in the network, but apparently the bots need some extra supplies nearby to encourage them to not wander off too far. Let's try that again. Soon after starting, I noticed a warning for logistic storage on Vulcanus running out, because this request setup apparently triggers production of unlimited barrels. Rather than try to actually solve that problem, I just set up some recycling to void the excess. On any other planet, I'd mourn the loss of resources, but this is Vulcanus, so who cares? Some time later, cliff explosives are becoming the import bottleneck. I check the excess in the logistic network and calculate that each train is only using 1.5 cliff explosives on average. So I change the combinators to only load 1 stack per train instead of 2. A while after that, and our foundation is dead due to lack of carbon fiber, which in turn is dead because every single spoilage train is imbalanced and stuck at a carbon fiber input. Forcing them back out pretty much immediately restarts production. Looks like we built up 50 train loads worth of spoilage in the system while the trains sat idle. I think this was another victim of my own cleverness. I allowed the logistics system to contribute excess spoilage to the carbon inputs, but I did it in a way that gave spoilage from the logistics system sideloading priority over spoilage from the trains, which means any bot-induced imbalance could propagate back to the trains. I don't want to give up on the logistics spoilage input though, so I just redesign it to give train spoilage priority over logistics spoilage. The machine is still running despite all this, but now we're starting to get bursts of lag, which seem to correspond with placing roboports. My guess is that adding new roboports to a network forces the game to recalculate the entire network area from scratch, which feels unnecessary, but hey, it's not like I've seen the source code. Regardless, even though the lag time will increase the longer the tube gets, it's still faster real time than it would be to rip up roboports as we go. Remember, the only reason I did that for Aquilo is because we had to rip up the heating towers anyway. Lag spikes aside, everything is working now, so it's time for montage number 2. halfway done. Onwards to Gleba. The only thing I think I need to tweak before starting here is disabling the landfill production so it relies entirely on Vulcanus imports. I turn the machine on and get brand new achievements for destroying a cliff and building a train. This was running on a second copy of the game alongside Fulgora, so I could get this video out faster. Anyway, the machine quickly starts complaining about a lack of artillery shells, and it's here that I realize this level of explosives production is probably insufficient for our needs. We can increase production at least a bit with some more speed modules, and we can reduce consumption by cutting the number of cliff explosives we're carrying per train like we did on Fulgora. Since we upgraded our Tesla turret damage, the rocket turrets barely need to contribute, so we can also get away with drastically cutting the number of rockets per train. In fact, the only explosive we can't compromise on is artillery, because just look at the size of this mess we had to clear out. Cliff explosive production is still barely limping along, though. I forgot that it takes grenades, which I'm only making in the mall. So I shore up its coal supply with a logistic network connected inserter out of the Belt Mall's coal plant, at the expense of explosives production. Now we have two more problems. This segment is taking way too long, and we're blowing through our stone patches way too fast. I try to solve the stone problem by importing all our concrete from Fulgora. But because I'm an idiot, that doesn't quite fix it. Turns out I didn't properly disable the stone stop that feeds local landfill production. That said, this stop is also the only stone input for the mall, which we obviously still need for rails, so who knows why I thought disabling it was a good idea anyway. Instead, let's just disable the landfill output inserters. Now the time problem. I'm assuming this is down to bot misbehavior as usual, so I track them down and find them far away from the front line, carrying rocket fuel? Okay, remember when I talked about filtering trailing storage chests to impossible items? Well, this is what happens when you don't do that. Somehow I forgot to include a filter for the train fuel chests in Gleba's filter blueprint, which meant every time a train was deconstructed, bots would carry some of its fuel away to other fuel chests, thousands of tiles away from the front. So after a trip back to the lab to add that chest to the filter blueprint, I swap it out and restart the machine from scratch. Again, I can't really alter anything while it's working, but it was only like 1% done when I caught this error, so whatever, no big loss. But then the timer alarm goes off again. Don't believe that clock. It isn't showing you the hours, because why would I need that for a segment timer? A bit of hunting later, and I find 3 bots wandering around very far from the front line. Let's give them a couple hours to sort themselves out.
2 hours later.
They did not sort themselves out. It would appear there's no reasonable bound on how far away a bot can be triggered. So at this point, we're basically forced to reconfigure the machine to sever trailing bot networks. That should be as simple as adding a trailing deconstructor filtered to roboports just after the one filtered to defenses. It should be that simple, but it isn't. It's a toss-up whether the bots that deconstruct the roboports reassign themselves to the leading or the trailing network. If they choose the trailing network, they freeze like a deer in the headlights because there's no unfiltered chest to drop the roboport into. That means we also need a trailing filter paster immediately before the deconstructor that removes the crude oil barrel filter on a single storage chest. Rather than actually add a trailing capability to the filter combinators, I decide to rush the process and just give this one blueprint a 500 tile negative offset. Surely this decision will not come back to bite me.
A few minutes later.
Shortly after turning the new machine on, it came back to bite me. Because I didn't even bother trying to configure it to skip the first 5 steps, it pasted 5 new unfiltered chests backwards into my base. Thankfully, the filter paster doesn't superforce build, so it didn't break anything, but wow, that was stupid. Then, a very important pre-flight check refused to fire because the machine used too many repair packs, which made the system assume the train wasn't carrying enough. I decide to fix this by adding more repair packs per train, and drowning out that specific signal so the pre-flight check doesn't care about repair packs. And then the same issue happens with artillery shells. I can't really fit any more shells per train, at least not enough to guarantee against this issue. So the best I can do is deconstruct the leading train to steal its artillery shells and then kickstart the machine. This does mean the train counter will be off by 1, but a single train shouldn't make any real dent in the headroom we've built in to keep the line saturated. Thankfully, that was the last error, so it's time for another montage. Oh, really? Now? What could possibly have gone wrong at 95% of the way? Uh-oh. Yeah, you know how this particular train is hauling an extra wagon just for artillery shells? Well, guess who didn't factor that into fuel consumption? 13 stacks of rocket fuel was plenty for everywhere else, but here it just barely isn't enough. Okay, we're maintaining 500 trains on the line, and the oldest save I can reload without completely starting over is from 448 trains ago. So even after changing the train blueprint and the combinators to carry more rocket fuel, there's still a handful of trains we'll have to refuel manually. At least the reload gives me time to prepare. Not exactly how I wanted to get that achievement, but whatever. Listen, it's a 4.5-hour ride there and back. I am not risking a second round trip just because I didn't bring enough rocket fuel with me the first time. After loading myself up and traveling 95% of the way to the corner of the world, all ready to save the day, I arrive to find nothing wrong. Yeah, all these trains have 3 full stacks of fuel. Before you ask, yes, this is still the old train configuration. I color-coded the new one. And yes, we're actually farther along now than we were when they started failing last time. Apparently, the reload alone just fixed everything.
Hello, IT. Have you tried turning it off and on again?
There's really nothing to be done here, so let's just head all the way back, I guess. Where were we? Alright, last planet. This was running on a 3rd copy of the game alongside Fulgora and Gleba, again to get this video out faster. If any devs are watching, thank you for the direct download portal. Let's see how she fares, shall we? This one will take a few segments to do anything interesting, owing to the area I've already manually cleared. I see the achievement for disturbing a demolisher and pan down just in time to see it explode. Then I happen to catch Aquilo being out of carbon fiber because Gleba isn't making enough barrels. A while later, and the taking too long alarm goes off, because there's no trains at the front, because... Okay, I admit it, I did not prepare for a demolisher being able to crack a supply train in half. Not that there's probably anything I could have done about that automatically, but at least the fix is easy enough. Delete the remains of the offending train and kickstart the machine. Again, the train counter will be off by 1 for every time this happens, but that shouldn't be enough to harm anything. In search of ways to get the low supply warning to shut up, I calculate that each segment is using less than 300 foundation on average, so I cut the quantity carried per train down to only 500. Far enough in, and we start getting hitches every time we place a new roboport, just like we did on Fulgora. I'd like to sever bot networks here, but that would mean limiting how many railgun turrets we have access to. We really can't risk that, so we'll just have to put up with the lag it causes. Thankfully, for whatever reason, the bots appear to be better behaved here than they were on Gleba. But that was the last major annoyance. Apart from an occasional supply train destruction requiring a manual restart, it actually made it all the way to the end all by itself. So, you know what that means. Four planets, 4 victory notifications, and now all that's left is to take the 4 journeys to the 4 corners. Which all seems fitting, given that this project took me about 4 months. But it's going to be another almost 5 hours apiece to actually take the train rides to the ends. I don't want to keep you sitting here for that much longer, so...
Many hours later.
If it wasn't already obvious by this point that bots are stupid, it would seem that they are perfectly happy to wander off into eternal nothingness given the right build command. Well, aside from Fulgora being predictably off-center, we've made it all the way to all 4 corners of the worlds. Usually people use the 4 corners as a metaphor, but here we are. Resources are still on default settings, and it looks like they didn't get richer farther out. I've seen patches with more lithium than this right by the central base. What is crazy are the stats. 6 million foundation just to Fulgora. Over 25 million landfill exported to Gleba. That's 1.25 million rocket launches for landfill alone. And I think it's pretty safe to say that almost 6,000 big demolisher kills is a world record, as are the nearly 4,500 legendary railgun turrets we crafted to kill them. You know, I've done a lot of things in my 5-ish thousand hours in this game, but this is the first project I've ever done that feels truly unreal. Literal months of running 24/7, build graphs that look like production graphs, train rides that take hours, and at the end of it all, being rewarded with 4 unique views of a void and a bunch of metrics that are hundreds of times higher than anything even remotely reasonable. If you haven't subscribed by now, I'm not sure what else I could do to earn it. On that note, I'd like to give an extremely special thanks to all my patrons and YouTube members, whose incredible support is the only reason I would ever take on a gargantuan effort like this one. It means the world to me that people like you enjoy what I do enough to contribute to it, so really, thank you. And if you'd like to hang out with such fine folk, come join our newly public Discord server. I've been getting asked about opening this up for a while now, and as a gift of appreciation to you all, I've finally decided to pull the trigger. Stop in, say hello, and stay a while. I'd love to have you there. But for now, it's finally time to close out. Thank you for joining me on this journey to the end of all things, and I'll see you here again soon.